What's up guys, it's Jenna with Dog Liaison, where I coach you on how to enhance your dog's mental health. You are about to embark on a compilation video in which you will teach your dog all of the basic skills that any dog needs to learn. In this video, you're going to learn how to teach your dog a marker word, teach the cue touch, teach your dog to come on cue, how to socialize a dog over 16 weeks old, teach your dog leave it, learn how often and for how long your training sessions should last, teach your dog stay, how to have your dog meet strangers without them jumping on them, teach your dog to stop jumping on you when they get excited, how to stop counter surfing, how to build trust with your dog, and finally, how to phase out treats. Now, of course, we have broken this compilation video down into chapters, so make sure you use the chapters guide in the bottom of the video to guide you to your next preferred behavior. Also recommend that you save this video in your library so that you can reference it back in the future when you need to refresh on those skills. Without further ado, let's get into it. If you are brand new to training your dog to do anything, then the very first thing you need to do is teach your dog a marker word like yes or good. It's actually a communication tool that you use to tell your dog, yep, that right there was what I was looking for, do that again. A lot of times people look at the yes or the good in dog training and people think that that's some sort of praise, as if we're saying yep or yes to be like good girl, good job, we like that, do that again. And it's actually a little bit more specific than that. It's actually a communication tool that we use to identify the specific behavior that your dog did in order to earn its reward. Now, to be honest, you can use whatever marker word you want to use. Generally speaking, you'll hear yes and good because those roll off the tongue. They're one syllable and they're really easy and they just come off. On this channel, you'll hear me say yes because that's the marker word of choice that I use, but to be honest, you can use whatever word you want as long as you don't use it as additionally in praise. When you say yes or whatever your marker word is, you are promising your dog that a reward is coming. So if you are saying it casually, just in day-to-day, like, yes, good boy, you're so cute, then you are kind of convoluting its definition. We need to make sure that we're only using this marker word to tell your dog specifically that behavior that you just did has earned you a reward. Now, you want to use the tone that you would generally use in life. If you don't typically say yes or good, if that's not how you normally speak, then you don't necessarily want to use that tone. Here's an example of me using the marker word yes in training. Yes. 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 Now, at first, your dog might believe that yes means I'm getting a treat. At first, your dog might be conditioned to just think that word means where's my food. But the more you integrate it into other parts of his life, like offering him a ball, or offering him a scratch on his belly, or offering him up on the bed when you want him to, the more you use it practically and just add some other reward in, the more he's going to understand that that marker word just tells him a reward is coming. It doesn't necessarily mean food is coming to you. To teach your dog your marker word, it's really simple. You just say yes and feed. Yes and feed. And then, to be honest, you're really only doing that a couple of times. You start integrating it with some other behavior. For example, if your dog knows sit, you might ask for a sit, and then you say the word yes at the precise moment that his butt hits the ground, and then reach for the treat. That's really important. That's something I want to emphasize, that you're saying your marker word and then grabbing your treat and then delivering it. You're not saying your marker word and delivering at the same time. You don't want to say yes, yes. Because in that case, your dog probably isn't hearing the marker at all. He's just thinking, oh my God, there's food coming. And the marker word you're saying is going to take longer for him to memorize. There are a lot of ways to get your dogs to focus on you. There are a lot of different tools, a lot of different cues that you could teach your dog. Watch me, look here, things like that. One of the best ways, in my opinion, is to teach your dog touch. Now, Touch is just the behavior of getting your dog to put his nose to your palm. Now, it's incredibly versatile. I use it in a lot of different capacities. The foremost being that it gets the dog to orient where you want him. So if you want him by your knee, you ask for the target by your knee. If you want him by a specific wall, you ask for the touch by the specific wall. It's a way to position him where you need him to be without having to drag his leash and coerce him into a corner. The other reason that I enjoy touch is because it's the exact way that I ask for dogs to meet and greet strangers. So you want to think of like a handshake. In a handshake, a person meets out halfway, offers their palm, and then the other person offers their palm. And with a dog, that's exactly what we ask the dogs to do. The person extends out their palm and the dog walks up to the palm and puts their nose there and asks for a meet and greet. It's a much more structured way. The other reason that you might use a touch is to get the dog to do a specific trick, like spin, roll over, things like that. Anything that you might use a lure for. And if you don't know what a lure is, you might want to check out this video, because in that video I talk about why it's not necessary because you have a touch. And in that video I sort of verbally explain what the hand target is and why it might be useful. It's a very good video, but in this video I wanted to focus more on how we get the dogs to do it, literally the training process. So that's what we're gonna do today. Okay, so you're gonna start with your dog in front of you and you're going to have your designated treats. I usually recommend starting this in a low distracting environment, which means that you can practice this with a medium or low value treat. And you're just gonna extend out your palm. Now your palm is gonna kind of smell like treats, but I do not want you to have treats in that hand. It should be empty. And you're going to extend it out in a reasonable space. Now, you don't necessarily want to put it right in your dog's face because that can be confrontational, but you don't want to put it so far that they have to walk up to it. It should be at a reasonable distance so that all they have to do is sort of extend their neck and their nose will tap it. Once your dog has looked at your hand, likely he's going to smell the hand and put his nose up there. Now, when you're practicing this, one of two things is gonna happen. One, he's either going to just look at your hand and be like, why is there a hand in my face? Or two, he's going to actually just naturally incline to approach it because your hand smells and he wants to put his nose up to it. If your dog is naturally approaching the palm, the good news is that you can just capture this, and every single time that he puts his nose up to your palm, put yes and treat. If right now he's only looking at your palm and he's not actually putting his nose into it, then you're going to have to shape this, which means that you're going to start off with him just looking at the palm and then graduate the criteria all the way to the point where he is actually approaching it. Most dogs, though, are probably just going to naturally approach the hand, because anytime that there's a hand in my face, I look at it and go, what the heck, right? And if your hand kind of smells a little bit, then they're more likely to approach it too. Yes. Yes. Now you notice in this video that I'm just saying yes right now. I'm not yet saying touch. That's because he doesn't quite know what the behavior is. He's not exactly certain of what behavior I'm looking for. It's not fair to ask a dog to do a cue that he doesn't know the definition of. When you say sit, 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 if he doesn't know what sit means, he's just getting frustrated at the sound. And it's the same with touch. We need to make sure that he knows the definition before you start giving in words. And that's one of the reasons right now I'm just saying yes. I just want him to make sure that he knows what behavior, what definition I'm looking for, and then I'll capture him and give him a treat for. Once your dog is doing well and is starting to understand the behavior, is starting to understand that he's supposed to put his nose to your palm, now it's time to start saying touch. And I want you to make sure that you're saying touch as close to the behavior as possible, because the further out they are, the more gap in between there is, the more likely it is that he doesn't know what you're saying or that he's not even listening. But if you can link that touch up to the behavior really close, he's much more likely to learn very fast what the cue is. Touch, yes. Touch, yes. Touch, yes. Sometimes your you're going to say touch and there's going to be a lag, and then the dog will do it. That gap of time is sometimes inevitable, and I don't want you to beat yourself up over it, but it is important that you're trying to diminish that as much as possible, and that for the most part, you're only saying touch as he's about to do the behavior and you're fairly certain that he's going to do it. Something to remember, and this is really important, is that you want to make sure that you're keeping your treats at a pretty neutral zone. If the treats are out and noticeable while the dog is doing the behavior, then you're actually just sort of encouraging a lure, and you're not necessarily capturing or shaping a behavior. So we want to make sure that the treat is coming out after the fact. And again, the video that I mentioned earlier is going to explain why that's so important. So make sure you check that out at the end of this one. Once you feel like your treats are in the right spot, you're starting to say touch, you're ready to raise the criteria, now you can start to prompt him even sooner, where you're going to start to say touch a little bit further out, and then you'll look for that deliberate response. Touch, yes. Touch, yes. Touch, yes. To start to generalize this cue, you can start to move the hand in different directions, maybe putting it over here, over here, over here, up, down. The one thing I don't suggest is to put it high off the ground, because that's just going to encourage jumping. But we want to make sure that no matter where the hand goes, the dog will target. The other way you can generalize this is by asking for a recall. So you're standing far away, asking for a touch from about 6 feet or whatever, and the dog will actually come to you. So touch, like I said before, is very versatile, and you can use it as a recall if necessary. And finally, for expert level training, you can absolutely have your dog target other objects other than your palm. So because touch is the cue, not your hand is not the cue. Because touch is the cue, you can eventually have your dog put his nose up to specific objects, like an X on the wall, like a person, and that is precisely what I do when I'm having meet and greets with a dog, is that the owner is the one that's saying touch, but the guest or the stranger is the one that's extending out that palm. So even though the owner is the one giving the cue and the reinforcer, the dog knows he's supposed to target the stranger's hand, not mom and dad's hand. Another way to generalize this behavior and make sure that it's nice and solid so that you can do touch anywhere, everywhere, under any circumstance, is to follow the 4D rule. And I highly recommend you check out this video, because in that video I discuss the 4Ds and how to make sure that a behavior is proved under any circumstance. So use touch to get your dog to orient on you. Use touch to get your dog to know where he's supposed to be. Yes, it's true that you're going to have to use other cues, like a name or watch me, something like that. Those can work congruently, they can work together, but touch is a wonderful versatile behavior that I believe every single dog should know. Let's get right into it. So the very first step you need to know to get your dog to come when called, which is also called recall, is to start in an open environment around the house. Now, this could be your backyard, this could be a long hallway, but it needs to be a space that you have a good amount of room, and it should not be in a very busy, popular, or unfamiliar space for your dog. You would not teach your dog to sit stay for the very first time, out in public. So we're not going to teach him to come for the very first time out in public. That doesn't make sense. If you are by yourself, you can still implement this exercise, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult. So I do recommend that you have at least a second person, if not 3 people. Now you are going to need some rewards. You're probably going to start off with some medium value rewards if you're starting off in the house. Now, as you increase the environment criteria, so you start to take this game out into the world, obviously you're going to need higher value treats. That's important. But when you are practicing this in the backyard, you're probably going to need lower or medium value treats, and every single person should have the exact same treats. I have played this game many a time in which I have one value treat and my client has another value treat, and the dog chooses one or the other more than the other person. So we need to make sure that everybody has the same value of treat. Now, everybody is going to spread apart and have their treats in a secure place, not out and bribing, which we'll talk more about in a second. And all you're going to do is say your dog's name, and as soon as the dog looks at you, you're going to say yes and feed.
Brian. Yes.
Good job delaying that yes. Good job. You can yes that.
Yes.
At this stage, you will not be saying the word come. We'll get to that in a second. At this stage, all you're doing is saying your dog's name. As soon as they look at you, you're saying yes and feeding to your feet. The reason you're feeding to your feet is because you want to treat your dog where you want your dog. If you want your dog sitting beside you, then that's where you want your food. Now, something to be careful about is that you are not feeding, or you're not delivering the food or demonstrating the food. The food isn't visible effectively until after you've said yes. And this is because if your dog turns around and your food is already out, you are bribing your dog, and this can cause problems down the road.
Yes.
Good job. Your timing on that was really good.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Good job. Do 2 more each.
Yes.
And if you want, you can spread out even more.
Yes. Yes. Come.
You're going to have the next person say the dog's name, yes, feed, and they're going back and forth in this manner. Eventually, you're going to see that your dog starts to predict the pattern, that your dog just starts going one and back and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And this is a good sign. This is what we're going for. So once you see your dog doing this behavior, now it's time to start implementing your recall cue. Generally speaking, people say come. One thing I will say is that you don't want to have several variations. So you wouldn't want to say one person says come, the next person says come here, the next one says come on. You know, dogs are memorizing sounds. And if you have different variations of all of the different sounds, your dog is it's going to take your dog a lot longer, if ever, to learn that cue. So everybody should be saying the exact same word. And for the purpose of this video, we're going to say come. Now, up until this point, you have been feeding pretty early on. You've been saying come, and then quickly after saying yes and feeding to your feet still. Now it's time to start raising the criteria. So what you're going to do is delay when you say yes. And this means that you're still saying come as soon as your dog looks at you. You're still doing that. But you're not saying yes until maybe he's taken 4 or 5 or 6 steps towards you, as opposed to just those first 2. Again, if your dog is having problems with waiting until the 6th step, then you can just say it sooner and you start to say it at 4 steps or 3 steps or whatever. If you need to say the word yes sooner, you totally can. But I do recommend that you are increasing the criteria as needed up until the point when you are not saying yes until they're all the way up to you, and then you can say yes and feed.
So don't even worry about saying yes until she's basically like right there on you.
Okay. Come. Yes. Come.
Good job.
Yes. Come. Yes. Come. Yes.
Now that your dog is doing better at this game, you're going to start to spread the people out further, and all the way up until the point where they're actually hiding behind barriers, and this turns into a game of hide and seek. Now, I do want to clarify that this is probably happening over a series of days. I would be shocked and almost a little bit cautious of someone who is able to progress this far at this point in just one training session or even in just one day. Please give this time so that when your dog starts playing hide and seek and you're hiding behind little barriers and asking them to come, they are already familiar with the game ahead of time. Now, at this point, once you're playing hide and seek, the criteria goes up pretty substantially, because what you're asking your dog to do is to respond to a cue of a person that he cannot directly see, and eye contact is gonna be more likely for a dog to respond. So if he can't make eye contact with you and he's just hearing that cue from, you know, a distance, he has to be able to hear it, acknowledge that it's relevant to him, and then demonstrate the behavior. That's why it's best at this point, in the early stages anyway, that you're still moving in that circular fashion and it's the same person going next and next and next. Down the road, you can start to randomize it, you know, where he really has to identify the person that's speaking and go to that person. But again, this is a harder criteria and you need to be patient. Now, in this video, you'll see that Rain is doing a really good job of being our demo dog, and you'll see that she's kind of doing a little skip to her person. She's kind of moving at a quick speed when they say come. Personally, that is what I prefer the dogs do if they're physically capable of it. I mean, if they're not physically capable of running or moving at a quick speed, then don't do that. But my personal preference is that I like to have the dogs come at a pretty reasonable rate. I don't want snail's pace. Now, that's a personal preference. If that's not a requirement for you, just have them walk. It's up to you. Having the dog that is socialized enough to go into public places pretty much anytime you want is everybody's dream. Unfortunately, the critical period to socialize a dog is between 3 and 12 weeks old. So what do you do if you have an adult dog who's technically past that critical socialization period? First, we need to acknowledge that socialization as a word is super vague. Now, scientists use it to describe that critical period between 3 and 12 weeks old, sometimes up to 18 weeks old, where a young puppy is experiencing the world for the first time and getting amicable and understanding what it's all about. But adult dogs and common dog owners, we use that phrase to really describe how dogs interact with other dogs and how dogs interact with other people. The truth of the matter is that socialization, though, is such a big umbrella term, and there are a lot of things that go under this umbrella. Socialization, that phrase, really encompasses different breeds and size and ages of dogs, different races, ethnicities, ages, and sizes of people. It encompasses different attire that people wear, including, cultural clothing and sunglasses and hats and all sorts of different attire. It encompasses different sounds ranging from Priuses to loud construction sounds. It encompasses different environments ranging from wide open fields with barely anything in it all the way to the most crowded places. And it includes different smells and more specific events like even children running and screaming when they play. So socialization is a super broad term. And with so many things that your dog is meant to be socialized to, it can be pretty taxing and intimidating for the common dog owner to know where to start. So in this video, I'm going to be giving you that step-by-step process to socialize your dog the correct way. Let's get into it. The first place to start socializing your dog is actually with your dog's genetics. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to deep dive into your dog's breed history and really get to understand what is their breed most prone to. What are the breeds most prone to liking and disliking? Now, genetics can't tell us everything, and I don't want you to think that just because, Google says that your golden retriever is supposed to be sociable and love every single person that he comes into contact with, that necessarily means that your dog is going to love every person he comes into contact with. However, genetics are the great foundation point. They are what everything builds off of, right? And so if you can just really do a deep dive and understand, is your dog meant to be more of an independent breed? Is your dog meant to actually be interacting with other humans, and that is where they are historically found, interacting and working alongside humans? Or are they meant to be more interacting with dogs? Do they tend to be very sociable and they like having groups of dogs together? Now, if you don't know what your dog's breeds are, then I do recommend you start with an Embark DNA test. Now, the reason I recommend Embark is because they are statistically the most accurate DNA test, but there are others on the market as well. I can't stress to you enough how important it is that you are familiar with what breeds are going along inside your dog. Once you are familiar with what exact breeds are in your dog, then of course you can use a Google search, but I also recommend you check out the dogkey.com, which is a free resource grounded in science. And actually, I also recommend you check out this video that I did with Kim Brophy, who designed the dog key, where we talk a lot about how DNA functions and how genetics work in really identifying breed traits. Now, of course, if your breed is meant to be a little bit more independent, maybe your breed is meant to have stranger danger, then that is something you want to be knowledgeable of and aware of when you take your dog out into the world. It doesn't necessarily mean that your dog will have stranger danger, but you just know that, okay, this is something that his breed typically might be prone to, and so we need to be watching out that potentially my dog might not like new people out into the world. And on the other hand, if your dog is meant to really love people and is supposed to be super sociable, and you notice that your dog is indeed very hyperactive and very interested in meeting every new person that he meets, then that is also something to be noted with as well. We're looking for indifference. That kind of leads me to a digression just for a second. I am going to be giving you the steps to be able to take your dog out into the world, but when you do that, what you're really looking for is indifference from your dog. You're looking for very subtle behavior, very chill behavior, as opposed to super enthusiastic or super, on the other end of the spectrum, super shy and sensitive and maybe hiding underneath your feet. So either end of those extremes are not really what we're going for. We're looking for that middle ground there. Now you might be wondering, well, how am I going to be able to read my dog? Well, I do have an entire dog body language playlist linked right here, and I recommend you check that out. Open this link in a new tab and really dig deep into that, because understanding, having at least a fundamental, basic level of dog body language is going to help you. Understanding what the lip lick means, what the yawn means, what a play bow means, understanding what those behaviors mean is going to help you when you decide to take out your dog and really have them interact with new or concerning things in the world. The next step is the experiment stage, and this is really going to probably take you about a week to a month long to do right. This is not a stage that you want to do quickly or just in one little trial. You want to run a couple of experiments. What I want you to do is create a list of all of the different contexts and circumstances that you might want to have your dog socialize to. So for my list, I had men without sunglasses and without a hat versus women with high-pitched voices, men with sunglasses, larger dogs, black-coated dogs, older dogs, all sorts of different situations that I want my dog to be socialized to. And out of that list, I'm going to pick the things that I think are going to be the easiest to start with. What do I think are going to be the things that my dog will be most successful based off of whatever knowledge I have of my dog? And then I'm going to put it on a very mild experiment. I'm going to put my dog out into the world. So let's say hypothetically that you have a golden retriever named Jack. And from everything that you know about Jack, he hasn't indicated any fear of men, right? You still need to experiment more, but thus far, you don't feel like Jack is afraid of men. And on top of that, you also know that Jack's breed is generally more sociable with men. So you're like, okay, so far this seems like this will probably be an easier thing to worry about. So you're going to take Jack out into the world and you're going to have him interact with a man. Now, to be clear, since you're really testing just his interaction with the guy, you don't really want him to be in a crowded environment. You kind of want it to be in a pretty empty environment so that you can really make sure that he's interacting with just the man, and the behavior you're getting is because of the guy and his interactions with the guy. And you're going to do two different experiments. One where the guy is not wearing a hat, not wearing sunglasses, and one where the guy is wearing the hat and is wearing the sunglasses. And you're going to gauge Jack's response, his emotional response to this person. Now what you're trying to do, this is my nifty little example, what you're trying to do is gauge where on this line is Jack's emotional excitement. Is he overly excited? Maybe he's lunging, barking, pulling, throwing a whole tantrum, doing the whole thing. Or is he really sensitive and shy and concerned about his safety? Let's say hypothetically that meeting a man with sunglasses fell about right here, and meeting a man without sunglasses fell about right here, right? And I'm gonna explain this box in a second, don't worry about that right now. But let's say on your spectrum of excitement, that's where you would say. So he's not completely excited, but he's not really sensitive, he's like right here-ish. So you think, okay, cool, now I'm going to do all of the other experiments, and I'm gonna do the same thing where I am marking them on my nice little list, on my little spectrum. So now you have this nice little list that looks something like this, right? Where you have a whole bunch of lines and it's all kind of on this spectrum of super, super excited because he's jumping up and down, whether he's too happy or because he's extra reactive, whatever it is, he's super stimulated, all the way to very sensitive and shy and reserved. And you've kind of done all of these experiments. Now, I want to be clear, some of these experiments you may have to do more than once, like on a different day or see how it goes. And of course, things can move around on a lot of different variables, but this is okay. The chart is just for you. No one else is going to see it. It's just for your frame of reference. I also want to mention that you're really taking things in control. So you're not like, you wouldn't jump from testing with one person all the way to testing with 25 people in a crowd, right? You're really controlling it and gradually increasing the difficulty as you go. I also want to mention that you would not go on to the next difficult thing unless what you just did had a passing rate. Now you might be thinking, what does a passing rate mean, Jenna? Well, I'm glad you asked. That would be anything that falls in this little box. Our goal is to try to get as many things inside this little box zone as possible, inside this neutral zone area as possible. And let's say hypothetically, meeting one person out into the world meant that he was able to do that with a pretty mild, okay excitability, and that fell inside the box. Well, that means that the next time you go out, you can try having him engage with someone who's a little bit more difficult. Maybe they have a high-pitched voice, maybe they are wearing all sorts of shenanigans, and see that. But the second that something falls out of this box range in one of these sidelines, that means, okay, we've basically hit our limit for right now. I don't want to try to increase the difficulty of the person that he meets too much. Our goal is to stay in this happy square zone for as much as possible in the experiment stage. Now, I am going to be showing you how we start working on the things on this outside, so we're going to get to that. But for right now, we're just trying to get as many things in this box as possible without testing too much excitement or too much fear. And that's really another digression that I want to take just for a second. The reason you don't want to test too many things that fall out here, the reason you don't want to have those experiences so much is because extreme emotions tend to have very long lasting results. So let's say the big black dog, for example. When we took Jack out, we realized that he was incredibly reserved around large black breed dogs, right? And what we found was that this caused him to have a hunched position. He really looked shy and he was just not happy. Well, if we keep putting him in situations where he's around this large black dog, he is going to learn that large black dogs are scary and bad. And now we have him having this predictive behavior where every time he sees a large black dog, he starts having a fear response or starts getting anxious. And this can make training much more difficult. So once you find something that is outside of that range, you take a mental note of it and you go, okay, this didn't fall in the box range. This seems to be a more extreme response. This is something that I'm going to need to work on, but for the time being, while I'm getting this sort of data, if you will, while I'm understanding exactly where my dog is in the socialization realm, I need to make sure that I'm limiting how many times he comes into contact with large breed black dogs. Okay, so at this point you have made it through the experiment stage and you have your long list of experiments that you've run. You know which experiences cause your dog to become too stimulated or too sensitive, and you know which experiments or experiences are going to make your dog just kind of mildly attentive. Now we're going to start the training process. We are entering phase 3. And in this phase, I want you to deliberately start off with the things that your dog is most successful at so far. What is your dog doing well and is handling correctly at this point? The reason is because we want to give our dog as much success as we possibly can before we start increasing the difficulty. And we want to make sure that our dog is understanding sort of a fundamental level of what is expected of him when he enters the world and interacts with different sounds and different people and different size dogs, right? So this phase 3 is the desensitization phase. And what we're doing is we're just going to focus on all of the activities that fell in this little box. If it didn't fall in the little box, then we're going to put it on the back burner and worry about it a different day. And that really means that you are eliminating how often your dog is experiencing those things for the time being. And you're just going to pay attention to the things that fall in that black box. And you might be thinking, yeah, but they were passing, my dog did well. Why would I want to pay attention to those? And the reason is because two things. One, you want to make sure that your dog continues to do well in this context, right? You want to make sure that he doesn't start to become overstimulated or too reserved in those situations. You want to make sure that his interaction with the guy without sunglasses stays solid. That's number one. And number two, you also want to make sure that your dog knows what behavior is expected of him. So for example, when your dog goes up to meet that man with the sunglasses, you want to make sure that he's doing it in a way that he is doing the engage, disengage correctly. So I do recommend, if you don't know how to get your dog to meet people properly, check out this video where I give you that explanation. But that would be the exercise that you would want to do in this situation. And this is really where we're training our dog to know, how do we greet people properly, or how do we sit at the park, how do we do stays at the park. This is really where we are doing the behavior element of it, but we're only worried about the behavior on the things that he did pretty well before. You are not expecting the behavior element out of the things that he had an extreme emotion just yet. So in this phase 3, it's really about getting your dog exposed to those different experiences that he might come into contact with, say a lady who is, clapping her hands, or is out walking with a child, right? All of these things that are mildly stimulating for your dog are not too arousing or too emotional just yet. You're focusing on the things that are mildly stimulating, and you're getting exposure to them while also implementing those basic skills that many dogs need. Now, as you move into phase 4, that is really where we're going to address those extreme emotions, and I'm going to walk you through that as well. But I want to be clear that you don't have to have all of the experiences that fell into this box, all of these mild excitement behaviors. You don't have to have those experiences down perfectly before you move into phase 4. That could take a very long time. You can sort of work on some of the mild activities or mild experiences, and then also work on the extreme experiences as well. It's just that you want to make sure that you have a good foundation in the mild experiences first. You want to make sure that your dog is progressing well, that you're communicating effectively, that your basic skills are right, and that your dog is, for the most part, progressing in the way that you want. Then you're going to tackle those extreme experiences, and that moves us into phase 4. For phase 4, you're going to use a technique called counter conditioning. Counter conditioning is the process of switching the association of a trigger first and then worrying about the behavior element of it. So let's take Jack's scenario. When we took Jack out, we saw that when he came across a woman with a high-pitched voice, he became overstimulated and he just lost his mind. He started jumping, he was excited, he was like, oh my gosh, get me to that woman, I must meet her, right? And we go, wait, we don't want this. This is too extreme of an emotion. So we are going to first try to get that extreme emotion mild down. That association needs to be less exciting, less happy, and just a little bit less stimulating, right? So our goal is to take all of these things that are on the outside of the box and get them into the box. We're gonna try to mild down the associations of all of the things that are outside the box, mild down those experiences, and put them into the box first. That's our number one goal. To do this, you're going to set your dog at a far enough distance where your dog is no longer experiencing the extreme emotions, so that he's no longer lunging, he's no longer jumping, he's no longer barking, he's no longer shying underneath your feet. You're not seeing that extreme emotion. That's how far back you need to be. Now that far back could be 10 feet, that could be 5 feet, but you want to back up a little bit. And when your dog engages with the trigger, so when your dog engages with the person with the high-pitched voice, you know, maybe she says hi and she says it really high-pitched, you will yes and feed. So that means that you're going to say the word yes, and then you will offer a treat. Now, you might also recognize this as the engage-disengage game, which is a pretty popular game created by Leslie McDevitt. And actually, in a couple of weeks from today, I'm going to be releasing a deep dive explanation on how to do counter conditioning. And if you're watching this video in the far enough future, then it is going to be linked right here. And I recommend that you open that in a new tab and watch it. If you're watching this before that video is released, make sure you hit subscribe so that you get notified when that bell or when that video drops. Also, I recommend that you go into the description box and download my free case study where I talk about desensitizing one dog named Levi. He was triggered by other dogs out on walks, and I have a full explanation, full case study explaining what I use and what I do to desensitize that experience. So I also make sure that you download that in the description box as well. However, for the purpose of this video, what I want to say is, when your dog is engaging with the trigger, you're going to yes and feed, and you're going to reward him simply for looking or hearing or seeing the dog or the trigger. And the reason is because you are creating the association that that thing over there has a positive outcome. And most importantly, that positive outcome comes from my human up there, right? That every single time I see something that is causing me to be really stimulated and I just have a sensation that overwhelms me, I know I can check in with my human because they're going to give me something that I like. The awesome part about this is that if you reward every single time your dog is engaging with a trigger, then you will get an auto check back in. Your dog is going to start to anticipate that that thing gets him a treat. And what will happen is you can start to delay your yes, you can start to delay your word and have your dog just naturally check back in on you all on their own. How long you're in this phase of counter conditioning is dependent on a lot of variables, including what emotion your dog is experiencing. You know, is it fear? Is it sensitivity? Is it concern? Those experiences are probably going to take a little bit longer to counter condition. However, you know, it also depends on your dog's history with that trigger as well. So how long have they been able to rehearse that arousal, rehearse that overstimulation? That said, once you do feel like your dog is like getting it, you're like, okay, they're checking back in with me, and you know, this is not as stimulating, this is not as concerning, then my friend, now you get to move this thing that was once very stimulating and causing your dog to be crazy, you get to move it inside that box. And guess what happens once you're in that box again? You get to go back to phase 3 where we're really working on the basic skills element of it, right? Once we've taken those high emotional experiences, desensitized them, put them at a milder rate, now we can focus on the basic skills part. We can really make sure they're understanding the manners. This is where we can work on loose leash walking. This is where we can work on the obedience part of it, right? So it's not fair to expect those harder challenges like, you know, sit or loose leash walking or stay. It's not really fair to expect those skills if your dog is experiencing an emotional rush. And if you don't understand what I'm saying right now, then I recommend you check out this video right here where I really deep dive on the brain chemistry and what is happening when your dog is becoming excitable and when he sees a trigger and he starts lunging and he starts pulling and he starts barking. What is happening when all that is going on? There's a lot of brain chemistry happening in that moment, and I explain it in that video, so check it out. An important thing for you to realize is that socialization is really just about getting your dog experiencing new, interesting, or relatively unusual events to the dog, right? He's experiencing those things, and the first thing that he's doing is he is assessing his safety. Before he can worry about what even behavior he's supposed to do, the first thing his brain is going to do is this a safe thing for me to engage with? Then once he's engaging with it, then he has to realize, how do I engage with it? So there's a lot of problem solving in this experience. Some things will come easier to him than others, and that has a lot to do with his life experiences and his genetic basis. So you will see that some things he encounters and he's just like, yep, that's cool, I know exactly what to do with that. And then other things and other experiences in the world he's going to engage with, and he's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. The important part is to be patient with your dog and to really be sympathetic and supportive of him and the emotional experiences that he's going through, the logical, critical thinking skills he has to work through as well. Before we jump into the tutorial, I do want to give the disclaimer that this activity is really not for resource guarders. If you have a dog that resource guards food, I really recommend you work through that issue first and then return back to this activity down the road. But assuming your dog does not resource guard food and assuming you think your dog is the right fit, let's get into it. The first thing to realize about the leave it behavior is that it is a learned skill. It's really not very innate. Your dog does not come pre-equipped with the ability to stop his compulsions and just not respond to it, especially with something like food or something that he really, really wants and needs in order to live. It goes against all basic laws of nature to just be like, I don't think I'm gonna go for that thing. So what we're going to do is make sure that we are giving him a trade instead. We'll say, look, I know that you think that thing is really awesome. I know that you really want that thing. I know that your genetics and your DNA tell you that thing is for you, but that's not for you. I don't want you to have that. So in return, I am willing to offer you this other thing instead. Your dog is going to learn better when you're offering a trade, not when you're saying, you can't have that. No, you can't have that. No, you can't have that. But if you're saying, I'll give you something else, I'll give you something else other than that, but that's not for you, they're more willing to bargain with you. For this activity, you're going to need at least 2 values of treats. You're probably going to need a lower value treat and a medium value, or a medium value and a high value. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, low, medium, high value treats, and you're like, what does that mean? Then this video is for you, and I recommend that you check it out. But for this activity, you will need just a small handful of lower value treats and a big chunk of the medium or higher value treats.
This is the thing you're asking her to leave, right? You're gonna put it on the floor and you're gonna cover it up with a palm like this.
Okay.
So you're going to put a treat on the ground and then cover it up with your hand, and you're going to put your entire palm on it. Then as soon as the dog disengages even slightly, you're going to say yes and treat. Now at this point, you are not saying the cue, leave it. You probably are not saying anything other than your marker word, which is usually yes or good. Now what you're looking for is for either your dog to turn his head away from your hand, to turn his back entirely on it, or at the very minimum to move his eyes away from the hand. The moment even slightly he disengages, you're going to yes and feed. You are throwing the treat away. You're tossing the treat across the room to the point where your dog literally has to turn his entire back away from the thing that you're asking him to leave.
Yes, there. So the second that she like relieved her mouth and she like, cause she was like nipping at you and then she stopped, that moment you can yes and feed.
Now, if your dog stops and freezes and, you know, you're not really getting him to look away or to disengage, but at the very minimum, he isn't, you know, attacking your palm or trying to get after the food, that is something that you can feed, that is something that you can reward, but you quickly want to progress out of that stage and implement harder criteria as you go. Remember that the leave it means disengage. Look away. You don't get that thing. Now what you're going to do is you're going to end up asking your dog to ignore the lower value treats, and in return you'll offer him the higher value food. Now this is because dogs learn quickest when they realize that they're getting something higher value instead. So for example, if someone said, look, you can take that $5 if you want, but if you don't touch that $5, I'll give you $10 back. You're gonna probably wait it out and get the $10 back, and you're gonna learn that pretty quickly, right? So you want to make sure that you are offering him a higher value trade. Practically, you're not gonna be able to constantly level up and offer him a higher value thing. Down the road, when you're out using this in the world, you may or may not have something of higher value than the thing that you're asking him to ignore. So in that case, it's more about making sure that you have a comparable pay, that you are trading your dog something of equal value. What you do not want to do is ask your dog to leave something and then pay him something of lesser value. That is a quick way to teach your dog that he loses out on trades, and he's not going to be willing to bargain for that. Once you have mastered this step, it's time to move on to the next one. But before we move on to the next step, smash that like button to let the YouTube algorithm know that you are enjoying this video. The next step is to move on to the claw hand.
What you're gonna do now is, instead of having a flat palm, I want you to do claw hands. There you go. And the same thing applies. The second that she disengages, yeah, that, there. Good. Wait for her to disengage. There. Good. There, take that. Good.
Yes.
Good timing. Really good timing.
Now, the claw hand is a way to accelerate the difficulty level, but you do need to be careful with this one. This is where the dogs might be a little bit more sneaky and be able to steal some treats. Be careful with that. Now, the reality is, even if your dog does steal treats, don't worry about it. Let him swallow the food. It's gonna be okay. This is why we start off with treats. This is why we start off with things that are low risk, because your dog is going to make mistakes. It's gonna be okay. Do not put your hand in his mouth and try to pull that thing out. That is a way to start resource guarding. That is a way to antagonize resource guarding. So do not do that. Just let him have it, reset, start over. It's gonna be okay. Now, as you start to progress in your difficulty by changing your hand positions and things like that, you're still not saying leave it just yet, unless your dog starts to predict that he's not supposed to touch it. Now, generally speaking, the way I see that a dog is predicting it is that they move their head from hand to hand. So they're staring at this hand, and then they're staring at that hand, and then they're staring at this hand, and then they're staring at that hand. And they're switching between the food that you're asking them to leave to the hand with all of the rewards. Be careful with this. Yes, that tells me that they're starting to catch on a little bit, but you don't necessarily want your dog just jumping between hand and hand and hand and hand. We're looking for the dog to disengage. We're looking for the dog to look elsewhere, move elsewhere, whatever. So if your dog is in fact disengaging and is not just moving from hand to hand to hand, then you can start adding in the leave it cue.
Leave it? Yes.
Good job. That timing was really good.
Oh, I forgot to disengage.
Okay. I would yes that and then just toss it. Because even though this isn't clean and perfect, it's at least that delay. And for day one, lesson one, that's perfect. Leave it.
Leave it?
There
Yes.
you go. Okay. Good. Be a little bit quicker with that leave it cue.
Okay. Does it when he's like walking in the direction, or he just is staring?
So the sooner you can say it when he looks at the treat, the sooner he's taking notice of the treat, that's really when you should be saying leave it. Leave it.
Leave it? Yes.
Good.
Now, actually, what cue you say, what words you say for the cue don't really matter. You can say whatever you want, but leave it is usually the common one. Overall, remember a couple things. One, you are asking your dog to disengage, so you're looking for your dog to move on from the thing that you're asking him to leave. Two, remember that you are going against DNA. You're going against his hardwired neural pathways that tell him he is supposed to eat the food you're asking him to leave. So give him the benefit of the doubt. When he steals one, go, oh, genetics won that round, and then move on. Okay, you were asking him to do something that is opposite of what his DNA tells him to do. So be patient with that. And 3, remember that you need to generalize this behavior. So just because you taught leave it in this context under this situation, now you need to start using other materials. You need to ask him to leave a shoe. You need to ask him to ignore whatever, a water bottle. Use things that are low risk first, and then you can start to implement it practically. It's one of the most common questions that my clients ask me, and there are general answers that I can give, and I will give them to you, but I feel like in order to really be effective, we need to break down those questions a little bit more. The overarching general answer that I like to give my clients is whatever's sustainable. I think the more cliche answer that you might hear from other trainers is 2 to 5 minutes, 2 to 5 times a day for a training session. And honestly, that's not a bad rule to live by. If you're looking for like a concrete answer, 2 to 5 times a day for 2 to 5 minutes each, that's a pretty reasonable expectation. But the reality is that not all of us are home 24/7 with our dogs, and we can't always trickle it out throughout the day. So sometimes you only have a matter of between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. when you go to bed. And so that's one of the reasons my answer with my clients is I want you to do whatever is sustainable. And the reason is because you are training your dog for life. Your dog is not in training for 6 weeks or for 8 weeks, and you are not putting your dog in some sort of high intense course, and then once he's through with it, he'll never have to train and learn again. That's not true. In fact, if you do that, you're more likely to get a lot of behavioral issues down the road. Learning is for life. So what I want you to do is make sure that you're setting up reasonable expectations for yourself that you can do sustainably. So make sure you stick around till the end, because at the very end I'm going to give you guys kind of a pro tip that I personally use in order to make sure that I am not overworking a dog or that the training session isn't going for too long. So the number one rule is just to remember that training should be fun for you and for your dog. And the second that it starts to feel like work, the second that it starts to feel like you are just exhausting each other, stop, because this is about sustainability. If on Tuesdays you're super busy, don't train on Tuesdays. Like, I don't care. If on Saturdays and Sundays is when you have the majority of your free time, but during the week is pretty difficult because of work, then say to yourself, okay, Monday through Friday, I want to hit 3 training sessions, but on Saturday and Sunday, I promise to hit, 4 training sessions each day, or whatever. But something that's unique to older dogs is that they may have never even had formal training before. They've never even experienced what it's like to go through a learning process or to have learning new skills trickled throughout the day. That might be a completely new idea to them. And so when you start working with them, even though, from a biological standpoint, they're older than a puppy, from a neurological standpoint, they're still pretty adolescent and they're underdeveloped. And so when you start training them to do new skills, that is equally taxing. If you haven't really been training your dog or teaching your dog any new learned behaviors in recent history, now you are reawakening literally parts of their brain that has been underutilized and isn't performing as proficiently as it should be, or definitely as proficiently as it could be. And so your training session should really only last between 2 to 5 minutes or so, if not shorter than that. And that is one rule that is true for all dogs across the board, is the longer you work them, the more likely it is they're going to make mistakes. I know that people want to have it in your mind that, if you just keep practicing, they'll get it. Just keep going, just keep going. We need to be thinking in terms of reality. And just because they're doing it wonderfully at the beginning of the training session absolutely does not mean that they're going to be doing it wonderfully at the end of the training session. And if anything, they're more likely to be doing it poorly. The moment that you see your dog is saying, oh, we're still doing this. Oh my God, here we go. Or likewise, the treats have lost their value, or toys. The reward that you were using has lost its value and it's just not as necessarily exciting as it was before. You have worked your dog too long at that point. The moment that you see your dog saying, I'm done with this, you have passed the point of when you should have stopped. You always want to end the dog's training session on a high. You always want to end the training session with him saying, wait, that's it? I want more. And if they're constantly stopping and saying, oh, really? You are not doing well to keep them motivated to keep learning throughout their entire life. And if you feel like you have gone too long because maybe your dog is saying, this is getting exhausting. You know, sometimes that happens. I mean, even to me, it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes I'll be working with a dog and I accidentally go too long. I thought they could handle 6 minutes, and at 3.5 minutes, 4 minutes, the dog is looking at me like, really? We're still doing this? And so it's important that I take the note and go, okay, we're done. No worries, you know, especially if the dog knows that you are working with a wonderful reinforcer, like their favorite toy, like their favorite treat, like, you know, you're giving them the belly scratch that they love so much, whatever it is. If they still decide to walk away from that reward and go, I'm kind of over this, you've ended it on a low and it's an accident, but you need to be taking note of it and preventing it from happening in the future. And as a pro tip, one of the things that I personally do is I do 2 things. One, if I'm working with my own dog, I often will do it on commercials. And I know you're looking at me like, who watches commercials anymore, right? But personally, especially if it's like a football game, I'll practice while all of the commercials are going. And then the other thing is that I'll practice during the YouTube ads. So sometimes you get the ads and the commercials in the middle of the videos, and I will let the ads run, even though I can skip. If I'm training my dog, I'll let them run because it gives me the perfect amount of time, right? Most of the ads are between 30 seconds and 2.5 minutes, and that's the perfect amount of time for training. So use those ads as sort of your time block to tell you how long you've been training for. So the other thing that I do is I will count out the amount of treats before the training session. So sometimes it's a matter of 15 treats, sometimes it's a matter of 30 treats. It really just depends on what it is I'm training and what is likely to be my rate of reinforcement. So how many times is the dog going to offer me an ideal behavior? So counting the treats out ahead of time tells me exactly how many repetitions I'm working with, and it is an excellent way for me to make sure that I'm not overworking my dog, make sure that I'm asking fair criteria of him. And in the case of an anxious or reactive dog or something that you were counter conditioning, you can use the amount of stimuli to tell you how long to train. So for example, you say, I'm going to train for 5 dogs, and as soon as I hit 5 dogs walking by my Bichon, I'm gonna go home, or whatever it is, right? Count the amount of stimuli that you want to do ahead of time, and then as soon as you hit that number, turn back. The thing to think about that though is that, for example, if you're on a walk and you hit 5 dogs and you are a whole mile away from home, you still have to walk back a whole mile, and you're probably going to come across more dogs on that mile. So if that happens, you really want to be thinking about, okay, I need to plan ahead of time, right? If I get 2 to 3 dogs going this way, then I need to anticipate that I'll probably have 2 to 3 dogs going back. The reality is that in terms of an anxiety-ridden dog, I would much rather you say, I wanted to hit 5, but I only hit 3 because of circumstances, than for you to say, I wanted to hit 5, but I accidentally hit 8, and those other 3 opportunities that a dog came up, my dog went over threshold. So I'd much rather you accidentally not hit enough training set opportunities than for you to overtrain and cause your dog unnecessary stress.
Stay, 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 stay.
We are breaking down
Okay,
the
come.
4 biggest mistakes I see owners make when they are teaching stay. The first mistake I see pet parents make, and a couple of dog trainers too, is that they walk backwards from the dog. I know that the purpose of this is so that we can keep an eye on the dog and make sure that they are not releasing before we ask them to, but it seems a little counterintuitive. I mean, how impractical it is to walk backwards from your dog. I don't know about you, but I don't spend a whole lot of time walking backwards anyway, but let alone looking at my dog and doing it. I mean, if I'm gonna walk backwards, I tend to be a little bit more cautious. So it seems very counterintuitive to do this, and to be completely frankly, you're gonna save a whole lot of time if you just turn around naturally and walk back away naturally. So when you put your dog in the stay, I want you to think about your first objective is I just want to be able to turn my body this way. And once you can turn your body this way, you'll yes, and then you'll release. And then you put your dog in another stay, and you'll turn your body this way. Then you'll say yes, and you'll release. And then you're gonna put your dog back in a stay, and you'll turn back this way, and you'll say yes, and you'll release, okay? And release treat. Now, you wanna take it in these little itty bitty steps, because if you just go straight to turning your back on the dog, then likely you are gonna make the dog move because they don't know what's going on. So you wanna think of the little transition here as a bridge, okay? Once you're able to turn your back all the way to the dog, now you can start walking away. So if you can't even turn your back on your dog, there's really no reason to be even worrying about distance at all and walking away from your dog whatsoever. Make sure you can practically walk away with your dog without actually breaking a limb. The second mistake I see owners make is that they repeat the cue stay too many times, and generally they change their tone.
Stay, 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 stay.
If this sounds like you, don't worry. We've all been there. We've done that. We've all had those human moments. But it's important that from now moving forward, we stop saying the cue that many times and repeating it like that. Now, I do want to add the caveat that I'm not completely 100% against repeating cues. In fact, I made an entire video that looks like this, and I'll link it at the end of the video as well. But it's all about when the two contexts are that you would actually repeat a cue. So if the stay falls under those two categories that you might need to repeat a cue, then by all means say stay again. But if you feel like you're saying stay for the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th time, likely you're either A, causing the dog to think this.
Why does Fu Man keep saying stay? I thought I does the stays. Is this not the stays I does?
Or B, maybe they don't understand and your expectations are too high. And in a moment, we are going to talk about how we set criteria. But for right now, if you feel the need to have to say stay 2, 3, 12 times to get your dog to actually stay planted, then likely your expectations of that stay are too high and you need to diminish your criteria. More on that topic coming up. The third mistake that I see owners make is that they do not have a release cue established. A release cue could be literally just release or free, but it could also just be a marker word like yes that tells them that the behavior is over. Often what I see is that owners will use the treat or the toy as the indication that a behavior is over, and this usually means that the dog becomes too reliant on a specific reward in order to perform the cue. What ends up usually happening in cases like this is that the dog becomes reliant on the movement of the treat, the movement of the toy to tell them that the behavior is over. So the second that you eliminate the treat or the toy from the equation, now the dog can no longer know when the behavior is over, and he'll just end up sitting there and you'll be saying release, or you'll be saying whatever word you say, like come, and the dog's just gonna look at you like, I don't know what you want, because they're so dependent on the movement of the toy or the movement of the treat to indicate to them that the stay has ended. Please. Down. Stay. Yes. That's why it's so important that you use a release cue like release free, all done, or just yes. Use some sort of verbal cue or visual cue that indicates to your dog that yes, the behavior is over. Now you can move. Now you get the reinforcer. So what it should look like is you put your dog in the stay, they halt, then you do your distance or your criteria or whatever, and then you say your release word. So you'll say yes, then the dog moves, then the reinforcer comes out in that order, okay? If the reinforcer is coming out before the dog has moved, then likely the reinforcer is acting as your release in lieu of what should be your actual release, like yes or a release word. The biggest mistake I see that owners make, and a couple of trainers too, and it's a bit of a pet peeve, I'll be honest, guys. The biggest mistake that kind of gets under my skin is that people will put their dog in a stay without knowing ahead of time what their criteria is. And what this usually looks like is that the person puts the dog in a stay and then just walks away arbitrarily at an arbitrary distance and stays away for an arbitrary amount of time. And they usually just have it in their mind, well, let's just see how long the dog can last. And the worst thing you can do when you're training stay, the worst thing is to put your dog in a stay and just see how long they'll last. Because if you don't even know what your goal is for your dog, how is your dog going to know what their goal is? And we want to be setting up our dog for success. So if you just go in with some arbitrary open-ended criteria, you're pretty much guaranteeing that ultimately your dog's going to fail at some point, and then you're going to have to just put them in that stay again. And what ends up happening here is that dogs start thinking that stay is a negatively reinforced or non-reinforced behavior. And so they don't look forward to doing it, because to them it just means that they get stuck in this cycle of being still, being still, being still for no reason whatsoever. That's why it's so important that you know ahead of time, before you put your dog in that stay, before you even call for your dog's attention, know what your criteria is. Know how long is he supposed to be in that stay for? How far away are you going to walk from him? Now, let's say that you put your dog in a stay and you want to build up for 25 seconds. Your criteria for this stay is 25 seconds, and you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and at 21 seconds, your dog gets up and breaks before you have the opportunity to release. Most people would then put the dog back in the stay and try to go for that 25 seconds again. I don't want you to do that. What I want you to do is put the dog in a stay, and this time, just count to 20 seconds. Again, this goes back to setting your dog up for success. If 21 seconds is where they failed, then 20 seconds is where they succeeded, which means that's your new criteria. And in theory, if you're always setting up fair criteria for your dog, they'll never fail at all. That's the perfect setup. But we're realistic, and we know that we're humans, and we know that we're gonna make mistakes. So if you do put your dog in a stay that they're not quite ready for, and the criteria was too high, then finding that out and readjusting it the next time for the next repetition to a more fair criteria is absolutely critical to getting your dog to listen in the future. Now, teaching stay is really about teaching impulse control, and I have created an entire video on how to teach your dog impulse control and why it's so important and how to use it throughout their life. And it looks like this. I'm gonna link that one at the end of my video as well. But we wanna make sure that when we're teaching impulse control, we're aware that this is a learned behavior and that we're treating it fairly. I do want to give the disclaimer that this exercise is really meant for dogs that are not fearful or cautious of people. If you are dealing with a dog who is experiencing negative emotions or negative associations with people, then this exercise probably isn't ready for you. It's not that you can never teach your dog this exercise, it's that you probably want to start off with this video first, this activity first, and then get through that, and then once your dog is feeling a little bit better, has a better association with people, jump right back into this video. All right, let's get into it. Now, I call this game the 3-second game, and I'm going to explain why it's called that in a second, but I do want to say that this exercise is better done if your dog knows the touch cue. So I do recommend that if your dog doesn't already have a hand target where they put their nose to a palm, if your dog doesn't already have that, check out this video, and you can just hit the little button, open it in a new tab, watch that, train that, you know, and then come back to this video. Because it's not that you can't do this if you don't know touch, it's just it'll be easier if you do. The second rule is that you want to make sure that you are teaching this in your home first, or in the backyard, in your area first, not necessarily out in public. You would not teach sit, stay in the middle of the plaza with 100 people around you. So you're not gonna teach this exercise in the middle of the plaza with 100 people in front of you. You wanna make sure that your dog learns the behavior first and then applies it to real life situations. So you probably are going to need a second person. Now, this person could be someone that they are vaguely familiar with. This could be like your neighbor, or perhaps a neighbor's friend who comes over, someone that your dog is pretty familiar with, has a positive association with. Get that memorization, that muscle memory down, not just in the dog, but also in you, and then start applying it with true through and through strangers. And then all I want you to do is, I'm gonna extend out my hand in a touch position.
Okay.
You're going to say touch. As soon as his nose hits my palm, you're gonna yes, and then feed him right back near you. That's all you're gonna do.
So I'm saying touch?
Yes.
Okay. Touch. Yes. Touch. Yes. Touch. Touch.
So don't worry about giving the point. We want to have him respond to the verbal.
Okay. I touch. Touch. See, how am I going to know he's not looking at me?
There you go.
Touch.
There
Yes.
you go.
Touch. Yes. Touch. Yes.
One more.
Touch. Yes.
So you want to start by having your helper person stand beside the dog, perhaps even in front of the dog. If your person is standing in front of the dog, they are not leaning forward and reaching over the dog. Actually, they're more standing away. Then the dog is walking to them, up to them, not necessarily that the person is hovering over. That's very scary. Next, your guest will extend out their palm and you will give the cue touch, or whatever target cue you have, to your dog, and then your dog will turn around, go to target the person's hand. Immediately, as soon as your dog's nose hits the palm, you will say yes and feed. Now, if you don't know why we're saying yes, or if you don't already have a marker word, then this video is for you. It's pretty simple. And additionally, the reason you are feeding beside you is because you want to get the dog to come back to you every single time. This also prevents resource guarding. Sometimes when people are feeding to the dog right there with the stranger hovering over, this can make a dicey situation dicey, and it can cause resource guarding. So to make everyone safe, we make sure that the dog is going out and then coming right back to you in order to get the food. So now I want you to just delay your yes by like a millisecond. He's gonna target my hand. I'm gonna touch him underneath the chin for like a half a second.
Okay.
Then you'll say yes, then he'll return to you.
Okay. Yes.
Good. Don't forget to say touch.
Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, again. Touch. Yes. Touch. Touch. Yes.
Good. See how he's pulling away before I had the opportunity to really shake him? That's what we're going for.
Okay. Touch. Okay, touch. Yes.
Okay.
Touch.
So, good. I'm glad you didn't say yes to that. That was really good. That was exactly what we
I
wanted.
tried to laugh at him like you're
Yep.
being five.
Now you'll see in this video that Clyde is actually making a sort of circular motion where he's going out and coming right back in, and going out and coming right back in, and going out. And this circular motion is exactly what we're going for. And the reason is because it makes the disengage just as part of the behavior as the engage. A lot of times when you see people teaching this exercise to their dog, they really get the greeting down perfect, right? The dog goes up to the person and everything's going great, but then you can't get the dog away and things just start escalating in excitement. It starts off very controllable and the dog starts dancing more and more and more. And this is because the disengage is not part of the routine. It's really important that your dog understands that it's not just enough to go up to the person and get love. Then I need to return to mom or dad and get my reinforcement that way. The other thing to realize is that a lot of times when your dog is meeting a stranger, a good chunk of the time, particularly if you have an adult dog, it's really for the stranger's benefit. To be completely honest, most dogs couldn't care less whether or not strangers are petting them. Some dogs do, but a good chunk of them, they're like whatever about it. So you have to realize that the real reward, the real positive reinforcement element of this exercise is the return to you to get that juicy treat or that whatever reward that you're giving. And if you found that tip really helpful, make sure to hit the like button because it helps me in the YouTube algorithm. Now at this stage in the training process, you're probably using medium value treats, but as you start to raise the criteria in a second, I'm gonna show you how we make this harder. So as you start to make the challenge harder, make sure that you are feeding higher value too. And this is especially true once you start to take the behavior out into the real world with real people. Make sure that you are using higher value treats. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, low, medium, high value treats, and you're like, what is she talking about? Then this video is for you, and I do recommend you check that out. It's gonna tell you all about the treat scaling process.
Hi, touch. Yes.
So see how he's curving himself in and he's making this little banana?
Touch.
He's getting
Yes.
me a
Oh,
side.
wow.
That's what we're going for too. We want that banana curve, how it's kind of making a big circle. That
Okay.
is precisely what we're going for.
Okay.
And the reason is because even though he's comfortable with me and straight on is acceptable because we have rapport.
Right.
If I was a complete stranger, him coming barreling at me nose first is a little rude.
Right.
We would want him to give us his side a little bit. That's
Okay.
more polite. Plus, giving his side means all four on the floor.
And not jumping in their face.
Right.
Okay. Touch. Yes. Is that too long of a wait?
You're fine.
Okay. Touch. Yes. Good boy.
Start to delay the yes just a little bit more.
Okay. Touch. Yes.
Good. That was a really good timing.
Okay. Touch. Wait, touch.
Okay. Pause for a second.
Touch. Yes. Touch. Yes. Good boy.
Good. The next step to making this more difficult for your dog, once they're ready, is you'll see before I was pretty calm, I was pretty controllable, I wasn't making too much silliness. Now we can afford to make silly faces, maybe make a little noise, maybe pet him a little bit more. You do this by asking your guests to subtly increase their excitability. You do not want to have them go from like a level 1 excitement to a level 25 in 2.3 seconds. That's not going to be helpful. You need to realize that you're asking your guests to start off with like a level 1, and then we're building to a level 2, and then we're going to make it a little bit sillier. Now we're making it a little bit sillier, and now we're making it a little bit sillier. And let's say you get to a point where you ask your guests to start singing the ABCs to your dog. Well, maybe your dog starts jumping at that point. Maybe your dog starts getting a little bit too rowdy, and their chain of going back to you falls apart. If that's the case, then you need to make sure that you are lowering the expectations, lowering your excitability. That will help your dog get right back on track. Now, at this point, you're still saying touch. You haven't started to transfer over to a real cue. But once you feel like your guest is at a pretty reasonable, excitable rate, and your dog is predicting that circular motion, and you're like, he is pretty consistently doing the right thing over and over and over again. Now we can start implementing the cue.
Go hello. Yes. Good boy.
Personally, I usually say hello, but you can say go see your friend or go get love, whatever you want. The other part of this is that we're really making sure that that time that he's with your guest is not exceeding much more than 3 seconds. Now, you're not literally counting. That was my dog scratching his ear. You're not literally counting 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. You're not saying that out loud. But you are going to make sure that you are thinking of it in your head, but make sure that your dog has not had the opportunity to stay with that person for too long. The other reason this is important, apart from the fact that you get the disengage, apart from that, because consent is cool, guys, we want to make sure that your dog is okay with the person petting them in that manner. So think of this practically. Imagine that you are out at the plaza and you have a brand new stranger and everything's great, so you tell Fido to go say hello, and then once he's over saying hello, you find out and you realize, oh my gosh, this stranger does not know how to pet a dog, and he's scruffing up his face and he's making big ridiculous gestures, and like it's just not okay. Well, you have the automatic disengage after the 3 seconds because that's already part of the chain. Now you can check in with your dog to see if they even want to go back into that person's arms again, right? we have that opportunity, because your dog is back with you, to check with them and be like, do they even want to go back into that person's arms and get more of that affection, or was that quite enough for them already? So the 3 seconds allows your dog to have the opportunity to decide for himself, I don't really like being touched that way, I'm not gonna go back up to you. Or, that was okay, I liked that, let's get more. And we do the exact same thing. I'm gonna start off really mild,
Okay.
and then we're gonna slowly build it more difficult, more difficult.
Okay.
But right now, say touch. If everything is going well, and we start to see him predict, and he's like, oh, I get this, we're doing this again,
Right.
then I might have you switch to the cue,
Okay. Say hello.
if that's what you want to say.
And then do we do low or high right now?
Let's do high for right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
He knows he smells the hot dogs.
Yeah.
Hi. Hi. Touch. Touch. Hi. Touch. Yes. That was I would.
That's okay. That's okay.
Touch. 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 Touch.
Let's try it a little bit this way.
Hi. Touch. Yes.
Good. We'll make it easier on him.
Touch. Yes.
Boy.
Touch. Yes.
We're gonna do one more. I'll go for a break.
Touch. Yes. Good boy.
Let's go ahead and let him chill for a second.
Definitely harder for him out here.
Yeah. Okay, so at this point you have the cue pretty steady with your guest. They are understanding that circular rotation. Your guest is reasonably excitable. At this point, you are going to start changing the guest around. Now, you probably don't want to necessarily take this out to the world just yet, or maybe at least know where you're busy. You're probably going to start using someone that your dog has never met before, but you do know. Or maybe your dog just doesn't realize that they met the person before, and that way you can have a little bit more structure. The more you can generalize this across people, the more likely it's going to be applicable when you actually need it. But you can't necessarily think like, oh, I taught them this exercise in my backyard with, you know, his friend Susie from down the street, and he got it really great on Wednesday and it was memorized, so that means that tomorrow I can take him out to the movie theater plaza and have 500 people touch him. No, it doesn't work that way. You're gonna have to generalize it over and over and over again, probably in a lot of controlled environments, and you're making sure that his progress is getting quicker over time, so that he's realizing how this applies to multiple different contexts. So in a moment, I'm going to give you a technique that you probably have never heard before to get your dog to stop jumping on you, but also to stop getting your dog to jumping on the craziest of people and guests that come over that get your dog all excited. But before we do that, I want to do a quick dive on what exactly this technique is teaching your dog. Specifically, the life skill that your dog is learning in this technique is impulse control. Now, you probably have heard a lot of trainers that say, well, your dog just needs to use self-control. He just needs to use self-control. What's lacking is self-control. And the problem with this insinuation is that self-control is just some sort of innate behavior that your dog just has and he just needs to whip it out and use it. And reality is that impulse control is a learned behavior. Impulse control goes against what innate behaviors the dog already comes hardwired with. And impulse control takes time to learn. And that's why this technique that I'm going to give you is meant to be used practically, but also meant to be used throughout the dog's entire life, because this learned skill is always going to be at combat with innate behavior. I want you to think of it this way. The dog's innate behavior, the instinctual behavior that is telling your dog to jump, is something that was a neural pathway that your dog came hardwired with. He popped out of the womb with this pathway in his mind telling him, I am supposed to jump, compelling him to jump. And now what we have to do with this technique that I'm going to give you is create a new neural pathway that is going to combat that innate neural pathway, and it is going to become so solid that the dog chooses to use this learned behavior alternatively to the innate one. Now, if this sounds like a difficult task, it is, and it's not just a difficult task for you, it's a difficult task for your dog. Recognize that learned behavior takes a lot longer for the dog to choose because he's not as necessarily compelled or inclined towards it. Now, impulse control is defined as the choice to delay gratification, and that delayed gratification part is super important. So teaching your dog impulse control is teaching your dog to delay the reinforcement, the positive reinforcement he gets from the jump itself. Now, the reason your dog is self-reinforced by jumping is A, it's just fun, they just like doing it, they're naturally inclined towards it, but also when your dog's jumping, it's usually happening in a context that is especially stimulating and exciting, like when mom and dad come home, or when the guests walk through the door, or when someone is saying hello to them and petting them, or when it's dinner time. And so because of that, jumping is also naturally reinforcing for most dogs. There are exceptions, but for most dogs, jumping is a pleasurable, fun thing. And scientists have been able to prove that with dogs in particular, dogs are more likely to delay gratification when they know something of better value is on its way. That's why the first part of this activity, before you even pull the dog out, is you need to think about what is more reinforcing than your dog's jumping to your dog. So in some cases, this is affection. I mean, giving your dog pets and loves and physical touch in many cases is very reinforcing for your dog, but it also can initiate jumping. So you want to pick a reinforcer, whether a toy or a treat or something, that is more valuable to your dog than the jump is. That's very important. I highly recommend you use a high value toy or a medium value treat or something like that. If you don't know what I mean by ranking reinforcers as low, medium, or high, I created a video and I'm going to link it at the end of this video as well so that you can go watch it. But effectively, we want to make sure that we are always paying our dog comparably. Except in this case, ironically, in this case, we want to be paying our dog higher. We need to be paying our dog higher than the jump is worth. So that is one of the only ways that you are going to truly be able to teach impulse control and teach your dog to delay gratification, is when he knows that if he delays it, he gets something more reinforcing at the end. So now you're ready to actually start playing the game, and I call this game the ABC game. Now, the reason I call it the ABC game is because I personally sing the ABCs to the dogs. You can sing whatever word, whatever song you want. You can sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Stars, whatever. The reason I picked ABCs is because it's easier for me to identify where I left off. So I can take a mental note that I left off at J, or a mental note that I left off at Q. And in a moment, I'm gonna give you a visual of what that means, and you'll have a little bit more context of how we're handling this. But you wanna pick a song or time limit that is going to be easier for you to identify where you left off. When you start playing this game, you want to play in a low stimulating situation. I know that most of the times when you practice jumping, you want to practice this in the context that the dog usually jumps. So when mom comes home, we're playing this right away. And there is a time and a place for that. And at the end of this video, we are going to get to that. I'm going to show you how to handle those situations. But like anything else, when you're instilling a new behavior, it's important that you practice first in a situation that is not dire. So think about this like when you're learning to drive a car. Nobody learns to drive a car when they have an appointment at 2:30 and they're running late and there's traffic. You learn to drive a car in a parking lot or when it's a slow day, right? And that's what you want to think of with this ABC game, is you want to start off practicing in a situation where it's not dire, it's not necessary, it's a low stimulating environment, low criteria environment. And then I promise you, I will show you how you can start to apply this in real context situations.
Sit. A, B, C, yes. A, B, C, D, yes. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, yes. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, yes.
Okay, so you'll see in this video that I was relatively calm. I didn't touch Yogi. I didn't really make a whole lot of facial expressions. I wasn't very silly. And I started off pretty monotone, right? Pretty low criteria. And I was just treating him for all of his decisions to stay on the floor. It's very important that you don't necessarily have to put your dog in a sit, in a down, in a whatever. I mean, you can if you want, but that's not really the purpose of the game. The purpose of the game is to teach your dog that he can do whatever he wants. He can wiggle, he can wag, he can be a dog, but he can't jump. And the moment he jumps, he stops getting treats. So you capture any decision that keeps all four on the floor, even if that means that he's walking away. If your dog walks in the other direction while you're playing this game, you still reinforce that. Because again, we're desensitizing what causes him to jump. That's the purpose of this game, is that we are eliminating the excitability of some of the triggers that would cause him to jump. So according to Brooks et al. In 2017, they did a study specifically on dog impulse control, and they compared it to social pressure and other psychological elements. And I'm going to link the study in the description box below if you feel so inclined. But one of the things that that study figured out was that the first 10 seconds of the dog learning delayed gratification are the hardest. You want to think of the first 10 seconds is going to be J, K, right? So all of the letters preceding J and K, you really want to take your time with that, because those are going to be the most difficult time frame for your dog, but it's also the most informative. It's where the dog is learning the most. So it's important that you are very clean with your information. If he jumps, he gets no attention whatsoever. If he stays on the floor, he gets a yes. And you're setting up criteria that he can do successfully.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, yes. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, yes. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, yes.
Okay, so now you're seeing that I'm starting to make the criteria a little bit more difficult. I'm leaning over, I'm getting sillier a little bit. This is when you really want to start thinking about breaking down your criteria. So maybe you start off by making facial expressions. You're still not touching your dog, but you're making silly facial expressions. Then maybe you start making hand gestures and you start going, oh my gosh, right? And getting a little bit more silly with your body language. Then the next criteria would be that you're leaning over. Only start to do the next difficult criteria once you're able to get through the entire alphabet doing the preceding criteria. So if you can't even sing the alphabet with silly faces and silly gestures and make it through that whole 25, 30 seconds, there's really no reason for you to start doing the other difficult things like petting him and leaning over and making it even more ridiculous. So you use the alphabet. Once you can get through the entire alphabet, you use that as an indicator of when you're ready for the next go round. Okay, so the very last criteria before you start applying it in its real context is that you're going to 10x your excitability. I want you to think about that crazy friend, that crazy aunt, the crazy person on the street that every time they see a puppy, they're like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. You know who I'm talking about, right? Like this video if you know who I'm talking about, okay? I want you to start to emulate the most difficult, challenging person that your dog is ever going to encounter. I'm not kidding. Get weird. No one will see you. Once you feel like your dog can handle mom at 10x and dad having a couple extra beers, right? Once you feel like your dog can handle that and still isn't jumping, now it's time to start applying it in real life context. So when you start to do this in real life context, let's take you coming home. Let's say your dog greets you at the door and jumps on you when you walk through the door. You need to start off in this context prepared. Because if you walk through the door and then go, oh yeah, that's right, I'm supposed to be playing the game, by that time, your dog has already started jumping on you. So when you practice this in real context, you need to walk through the door knowing, I am going to jump right into the ABC game. I am prepared. I have my reinforcers ready. I'm going to capture him as soon as he's on the floor. Everything that he does well, I feed on the floor. One thing to know though is that because you have started to use this in the real life context, your criteria has gone up, which means that you probably are not going to be able to make it through the whole alphabet. So when you walk through that door, you don't want to just anticipate that, oh, I'm going to be able to make it through all the way through Z. You want to think, I'm going to make it to J, or I'm going to make it to L. Because even if you were able to get from A to Z in a low distraction environment, the second that you put that practically, you've raised the criteria. So it's important that you lower your expectations a little bit of how far into the alphabet you'll get, until eventually you can get through the whole alphabet. And honestly, you could sing the alphabet as many times as you want. I mean, if you go a whole 30 seconds and now you're ready to raise the criteria past 30 seconds, keep going, sister. Just be fair in your assessment. Be fair of what criteria your dog can actually handle. Now it's time to start to practice this with other people. Maybe your aunt is finally over. But when you're practicing this with a guest, again, we're starting off with lower alphabet. So we're not trying to make it from A to Z right out of the get-go. We're starting off with, I just want to get to L. I just want to get to C. Maybe your criteria is, I just want to be able to make it through the first 3 seconds with him on the floor, right? And treat him every single time he has the choice to jump and chooses not to. It's very important that you recognize that impulse control when it comes at you. And a lot of times we look at it as stubbornness and we ignore it because we think, well, it's not going to stay for very long. He's going to jump in 3 seconds. It doesn't matter. You still got 3 seconds right there of impulse control, and you need to be rewarding that, because otherwise it's going to go away altogether. I definitely recommend that you are the one feeding the treats instead of your aunt, particularly if your dog is very friendly and very social and likes everyone. You feeding is going to keep you more valuable, and you should always be the most valuable thing in the space. The more valuable you are, the more reinforcing you are, the more likely it is your dog is going to be able to follow through on some of your cues that you ask him. Now, you are going to start to realize that your dog is becoming much more proficient in this behavior. It's much easier, much quicker for him to stay on the floor. He understands the game. He understands getting weird with you, and he's still not jumping on you. And that is because you have created a very good foundation for a learned behavior. You've started to create that neural pathway that your dog is going to use in lieu of the instinctual pathway that's telling him to jump. But just because that pathway, that learned behavior, is becoming more accurate doesn't necessarily mean that your dog is going to be able to choose that learned behavior over his instinctual behavior. That part takes a lot of time, and you have to give him the benefit of the doubt. Remember that we are creating a whole new neural pathway for your dog, and it is supposed to effectively undo an instinctual pathway. And that's very difficult. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of maintenance. That's one of the reasons I want you to really take your time with this behavior. Practice it several times. I mean, in the footage you saw that I was practicing with Yogi all in one day, and that was just for the sake of filming. Obviously, I'm practicing way more frequently than that, and I want you to as well. And as a general rule, you want to practice 2 to 5 minutes, 2 to 5 times a day throughout the day. Obviously, that's very relative. It's very general. I want you to do what you can. But I promise you that impulse control is something that is heavily reliant on rehearsal. It is, the brain needs to practice doing the same thing over and over and over again before it becomes so inclined to choose that option over one that it has been doing its entire life. Some other contexts that you can practice this in are on walks when you are coming across a neighbor or stranger. You can practice this during roughhouse play, so maybe you're outside and you're playing fetch and you want to teach the dog not to jump. Practice this around young children. Just make sure that you have some barriers up so that the children can't get hurt. Remember that impulse control needs to be maintained throughout the dog's entire life. We were talking about counter surfing. We're talking about why it happens and how to fix it. Today, I wanted to give the big fancy term about contra freeloading, and this is directly correlated to counter surfing. So contra freeloading is the observed behavior in animals that says that they like to work for food more than readily available free food. And now this is especially true for the nourished dog, the nourished animal, the one that's not necessarily starving. But if you've got a healthy animal, what you'll find is that they actually enjoy the process of working for food way more than just kind of having it readily available sitting in the corner. Now, contra freeloading is directly related to your dog's counter surfing in that you're adding a little bit of a challenge, and that challenge is enticing. So we know this based off of dopamine levels. Now, dopamine levels are the happy chemical. Dopamine is always released when you're excited about something or something wonderful is happening to you. You can also call it the pleasure chemical. And they have tracked dopamine levels in many different animals and the opportunity to work for food. And what you would think is that the dopamine levels would go sparking high as soon as they got the treat, right? As soon as you give the dog or the monkey or the whatever, the food, that's when the dopamine would be released. But continuously, what they have found is that the dopamine levels increase at the opportunity for the food. So my very favorite example of this came from Dr. Robert Sapolsky. He's a professor of neurology and biology at University of Stanford. And I'm actually going to link a video in the description below if you feel so inclined in finding a little bit more about this experiment. But basically what they did was they taught a monkey that every single time he pushed a lever, he would get a treat. Push the lever, get a treat. Push the lever, get a treat. Guaranteed success every single time. And when they tracked the monkey's dopamine levels, what they found was that the dopamine levels would increase at the opportunity to push the lever. So as soon as he understood that push the lever, get food, that's when the excitement started coming up. That's when the happiness started to be released. And the opportunity for the food was much more enticing than the actual food. And in fact, dopamine levels decreased as soon as they got the food. So then they took this experiment a step further and they added in the variable of maybe. So what this looked like was monkey would push the lever and sometimes he would get the treat and sometimes he wouldn't. It was randomized, it wasn't structured at all. Sometimes he got it, sometimes he didn't. And what they found in this case was that the dopamine levels increased even further at this opportunity of maybe. So I has a history of getting food, so maybe I'll get it, maybe I won't. That challenge is enticing, I like it, let's do it. And still, as soon as the monkey got the treat, that's when the dopamine started to dwindle down again. So what this means for you is that your dog loves the variable of maybe. And what I want you to think about right now is Vegas, right? You go to Vegas and you know that it has a history of being reinforcing. You know that Vegas has a history of paying out a lot of money, but you also know that the odds are kind of against you. So the challenge of beating the odds, the challenge of getting the money despite reality is actually so stimulating and so enticing that Vegas makes a lot of money on maybe, right? And this is what the dogs are experiencing. They know that the odds are against them, that they're probably not going to get into the bag that's pushed all the way into the back corner. They know that they're probably not going to be able to get the treat that's sitting in the middle of your coffee table right now. But the opportunity is so enticing, the dopamine levels increase so much at this challenge that it's worth the shot. And no matter how many times you try to make it a negative thing, no matter how many times you yell at him or correct him or tell him leave it or whine or complain, it's never going to diminish the dopamine levels, the excitability of having that challenge of beating the odds. So how do we fix this? If we know that the dogs like the challenge, if we know that the dogs want to search for their food, they want to work for their food way more than if you just got the food sitting over there in the corner, how do we use this to our advantage? Well, for starters, if you're free feeding right now, I highly recommend you stop, pick that bowl up, because like we just discussed, the free food is not going to be nearly enticing enough, and it's just kind of encouraging him to want to go to that other less valuable, or I'm sorry, more valuable, less accessible food in the other corner, right? So if you are free feeding, pick that up. That's number one. If you're just feeding your dog in a bowl every 1-2 days, that's not that big of a deal. But if you're feeding your dog in a bowl twice a day, 3 times a day, every single day, that becomes very mundane for your dog, and he's looking for more engagement. He's looking for more challenge. And you putting that, yummy peanut butter sandwich at the very back of your counter is actually exactly the challenge your dog is looking for. So if anything, you are asking him to work for that peanut butter sandwich way more than you're asking him to work for the kibble that you're just readily available in the bowl. Number 2 is we want to use the scatter, hide, stuff method. Now this is something that I kind of creatively put together. Now the scatter method is in which you go into a big open field, and I'm not joking, just fling the food up in the air, let the kibble fly in all which directions, and make the dog search for it. This is a great way to get the dog to be exposed to a new environment. So if you've got a younger puppy who's working on socialization and being exposed to new environments, a field or a park where you can scatter some food and get his nose on the ground and sniffing and thinking, that's wonderful. The stuff method is probably where you're going to take a Kong full of peanut butter or some sort of food puzzle, but the free alternative to this is actually just to get a cupcake tin and put kibble in each of the cupcake slots, and then stuff on top of the kibble in the slots socks or toys or whatever is going to hide the kibble underneath it, so that the dog actually has to fling the toy out of the way in order to get it. You could also stuff Amazon boxes and put food in the middle of an Amazon box. The other solution is to hide food. So putting food in little secret corners where you can make the dog seek it out and sniff it out. And sometimes you have to help them, especially if this is a new game. You can Google find it, it'll help you. Especially if this is a new game for your dog, you may need to make it sort of easy so that they're proficient. Anytime that you're making a dog work for food, you definitely want to gauge the confidence level, because very similar to Vegas, remember, they're only going to want to continue doing it if it has a history of being reinforcing. So the first couple times that you play these challenges, if they're failing continuously, if they're not getting to the food, if they're not understanding the success rate, it's not going to stick around for very long. They're going to stop doing it because it doesn't have that reinforcement of working in the past. So it is important that they have enough success at the beginning that later on, when you make it more challenging, it's still worth going for it, because they know it has such a good history and such a value to their life in the long run. So using the scatter, hide, stuff method is going to help you really engage your dog in a way that he is begging, literally, to be engaged. And that is, I want to work for food. I want to think about the food. And obviously, if you're teaching your dog a new behavior, that's a great way to get the dog to work for food. The last method that I really want you to think about is getting the dog to understand that he is going to be paid higher if he's actually on the floor. So if we know that jumping on the counter is really exciting, if we know that jumping on the counter is going to be engaging for your dog, then what you want to do is make sure that you are combating the positive of being on the counter with an even higher positive of being on the floor. So it's not so much that we're making jumping on the counter bad, it's that we're making being on the floor better. So for me personally, I don't really care if the dog's in a sit stay. If you want to teach in place, it's fine, it's effective, but it shouldn't necessarily be the only solution. You can absolutely just capture a dog for being on the floor. So you'll see in this video with Yogi that I was actually capturing him for all of his decisions to be on the floor. I was just making eggs in the kitchen, and I captured him any opportunity that he decided to stay on the floor despite me having those yummy eggs on the counter. There were a couple of times that he makes mistakes. That's normal. And the one thing that I like is that mistakes are also informative. If the dog jumps on the counter, that is just as informative as when he doesn't jump on the counter. Because what he is learning is that if I jump on the counter and try to go for the eggs, I do not get treats. So that moment is just as informative for your dog as the moments that you are treating him. I am always feeding away. You always want to feed your dog where you want your dog. It doesn't make sense to feed him right by the counter if that's not where you want him. If you want him in the outside of the kitchen line, or if you want him on his bed, feed him on his bed. The idea though is how little I'm talking and how little I'm engaging with him. The more you engage with your dog, the more you make a fuss about it, the less likely he's gonna walk away and ignore you. The more likely it is he's just gonna sit there and be engaged and go, yay, party, 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 party. So it's important that it's as non-event, nonchalant as possible, and he's only getting the event of the payout when he's on the floor. The other thing to remember is that when I am playing this game, I'm really only feeding with medium value treats. I'm not feeding with very high value treats. The high value food should really be left for his engagements. It should really be left for when he's, playing the scatter, hide, stuff method. So if you're making it just as enticing to play the game in the kitchen as you are to play his games outside in the scatter, hide, stuff method, there's not a very clear distinction, and he's gonna say, well, I'll just pick, I love both equally. When in fact, what we're really trying to instill is that, yeah, being in the kitchen is cool and it's not bad as long as I'm on the floor, I get stuff and that's chill. But what I really love is the games that we play in the backyard, or there's the games that we play in the living room where mom hides all of my kibble and I have to use my nose to stuff it out. That is the real lesson that we're trying to instill. This particular video was inspired by one of my clients in the Recovering Rover program, which is my signature program to treat reactive, anxious dogs. And one of my dogs in that program was struggling with his relationship with his owner. And so we immediately implemented this protocol that I'm gonna share with you today, and it has exponentially increased his trust and his relationship with his dog mom. Now, I recently posted a video on how to bond more with your dog, and you can check that out if you haven't already. Open that link in the new tab. But in that video, I talked about the importance of having your dog trust you. And there is a subtle difference between trust and bond. Trust requires safety, and more specifically, it requires the perception of safety. Your dog must perceive that he can rely on you to have his back, that he can rely on you to feed, to give food, to deliver water, to have shelter, to have a sense of security. These are all things that come into play with trust. So you're going to do a process called counter conditioning, in which you pair a positive thing with your dog's trigger. And in this case, your dog's trigger might be you walking into a room, or it might be you fidgeting. And for a longer explanation, a more scientific approach to counter conditioning, I do recommend you check out this video, because in this one today, we're gonna give you kind of an overview, but if you wanna completely nerd out, then that video is for you. But effectively, what you're going to do is very absent-mindedly drop a high value treat every single time that your dog looks at you or walks in your direction. You'll see in this video with Jack that one of the things we did was feed him every single time he naturally walks up to his dog mom. And additionally, I had my client look very aloof. I had my client very subtle, very discreet, and not overt. We are not in a formal training session in this moment. I often will have my clients do something like watch TV or look at their phone or whatever while they do this activity, and they're using their peripherals. When their dog approaches, they toss that treat into the dog's space, and then they just wait for the dog approach again. What you are doing in this technique is you are conditioning your dog to know that as he approaches you, something good and awesome happens. In this case, he gets a high value treat. You can start this activity off with you just sitting around and lounging and being very still, and then slowly implement it where you are adding more movement. In Jack's case, for example, he was especially triggered when his dog mom would stand up or when she would walk around. And so moving one position at a time. We're really thinking about putting one leg down at a time, as opposed to just abruptly standing up.
The other thing that you are going to want to experiment with is, looks like right here, you tossed it with an open palm, right? I would deliberately make sure every single time you toss it, it's an underhand as opposed to an overhand,
Okay.
right? So making
Yeah.
sure that you're throwing it from this position as opposed to like a fist. So this is effectively the reverse of what we were doing with the marker that I showed you with the video. With the video, you were
Yeah.
staying planted and he was walking towards you. And in this case, he's basically staying planted in a general vicinity, and you're walking into his space and he's reaping the benefit of that. And as you start to walk in his direction, you're just going to make your little yes marker, the marker that you use, and toss the treat underhanded in his direction and immediately walk away.
Okay.
Yep, and walk away. Don't worry about moving. Let him keep doing his thing. And now, again, you're going to walk in a different direction, still not towards him, but maybe towards like your patio there, right? And as you're reaching closer to him, you're going to make the marker, feed, and walk away again. So when you're doing this, you're never walking at him. You're just walking in his space, marking, and walking away.
Okay.
There's a huge difference between walking in his space and walking towards him. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So if you're walking towards him, there's social pressure. If you're walking in his direction or in his vicinity, you might just be going to the porch. You might be just going to the back of the yard. You might just be, right? There's other things you might be doing that, hey, if she's going to keep throwing treats at me for it, I don't care, right?
This is a bad throw.
Okay. The key is that he's also saying you walk away, because right now your walk away is also acting as a reward.
Oh, gotcha.
And depending on how he's feeling, like emotionally how he's feeling, it could potentially be the primary reward. So you walking away could be even more rewarding than the food, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So that's why it's so important that he sees you do that, because it's almost like we're asking, eventually he's going to keep following you. You're going to walk away and he's going to be like, wait, come back.
Okay.
And now we know, okay, he's catching on to the game. He doesn't quite know all the rules, but at least, the very least, you walking with food isn't threatening.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Walk away.
You think he knows I walked away even though he wasn't looking at me, right?
Yes.
Like he doesn't have looking right at me to know that I moved away.
Right. He has peripheral vision just as much as we do. And at the very least, he sees that, or he smells that your scent is getting further away.
The other way that you can build trust with your dog is to have a very predictable structure for your dog. If your dog knows I'm going to eat at this time, or I'm going to drink at this time, or I'm going to have a walk every single day, if your dog can predict those things about his life with you, that will implement so much more structure and reliability. Remember, trust really comes down to predictability. Your dog needs to be able to predict that XYZ is going to happen and ABC will not happen, right? And so the more structure, the more predictable you can be that good things happen in this order, in this manner, the easier it'll be for your dog. I also do want to suggest that if you have a new dog, if for example he's a new rescue or he's been recently displaced, put in a new home, whatever it is, if that's the case, you do want to give your dog a little extra time. Your dog is trying to figure out, first of all, is he safe? He's trying to figure out if he's going to eat. He's trying to figure out where he's going to sleep. He's trying to figure out what his routine is. And so a lot of that comes with repetition. And the more you do those experiences, the more he goes, okay, I see what's happening here. I can rely on you to do XYZ for me. So if he's new to your family, do give him a little bit more patience. Again, still keeping that pressure off. A huge point that I like to drive home with my clients is that you do not have to pet your dog. You do not have to physically give affection to your dog in order to establish trust. In fact, many dogs gain trust by not being touched. If I'm working with a highly reactive dog or a dog that is fearful of me, I'm not going to put my hands on that dog, because not only is it a potential threat, I mean, I could injure myself doing that, but on top of that, that's not what he's saying he wants. And I'm going to be able to build a stronger relationship with him by respecting his boundaries and respecting his space and not petting him without him asking for it. Because guys, on this channel, the #1 rule is consent is cool. Your dog has the say. Your dog controls when you pet him. You do not control when you pet him. A huge dog training myth is that as soon as your dog has learned a behavior, like sit, for example, you no longer need to treat it. There is actually a much more methodical, strategic way that we phase out treats over time when we're dog training. Which technique you use for your dog kind of depends on how much intrinsic reward is in the behavior. So there's intrinsic rewards and there's extrinsic rewards. Extrinsic rewards are treats and toys and things that your dog receives externally from the universe. Intrinsic reward is everything that is happening internally. So that is that dopamine kick, the oxytocin, the serotonin, all of those things that are happening within the dog that makes him just like doing it. And so what you kind of want to think about is, if your dog has a high intrinsic reward, if the activity that he's doing has a high intrinsic value to him, then you can kind of get away with a lower extrinsic treat or food or whatever. But if the behavior has a kind of a lower intrinsic value and it's just kind of like meh to him, well, in that case, you're gonna need to give him a higher external reward. That thing that you give him is gonna have to be very motivating so that he wants to keep doing it. And of course, if there's very little intrinsic reward to it, perhaps you're training something that is scary and desensitizing a trigger, or has something that's very challenging. If that intrinsic reward is pretty mild at the moment, you're gonna need to bump up the value of the extrinsic to make it very reinforcing. The first way to fade out food is to lower the value of treats. So we have talked a lot about on this channel, and you can check out this video for more about it, about how we have high, medium, and low value treats. And so if, for example, you have been using high or a medium value treat to train a behavior, well, then you can decrease the value of the food, maybe give him a less valuable food as his reward. So you're still feeding as frequently, but you're feeding a lower value treat. That's #1. The other way that you can look at this is to feed still with high value treats, but expect more behaviors from it. So for example, maybe instead of just getting 1 sit per treat, you get 3, 4, 5 sits per treat, or you get a sit stay per 1 treat. So you're getting more behavior for the same value, the same high value food that you were giving before. And finally, you can do something called intermittent reinforcement, which is basically randomized rewards. So you feed a varying degree of treats. Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's medium, sometimes it's low. It's very randomized. Plus, you may fluctuate the frequency at which you feed. So sometimes you feed every 1 treat, or sometimes you feed every 3 treats. The caveat I want to give to this is that the more neurotic dogs, or the more I guess high drive dogs, tend to not like that unpredictability. When we start doing intermittent rewards, that is a way to phase out treats, that's true, but you can actually end up hurting yourself if it's done to the wrong dog, because they're going to be upset with the unpredictability of it and how randomized it is. So if that seems like your dog, don't do that method. Now, of course, there are a bunch of other types of rewards that you can give your dog that are not food or treats. And so if you're interested in finding out more about that and how you can incorporate some of those other types of rewards into your dog's life, check out that video, because it's going to help you tremendously. And again, you are constantly adjusting your extrinsic reward according to how valuable or how intrinsically rewarding the experience is for your dog. So you're looking for those happy taps. You're looking for how frequently your dog is coming back. How hard is it to engage your dog to participate in the experience or in the training process? The more intrinsically rewarding, the more self-motivated the dog is to work for you, the less you owe from an external perspective. Sort of. It depends on the difficulty of the challenge. And so you were thinking about all of these things when you were considering specifically what treat to deliver at what given moment. Thank you so much for watching this compilation video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to hit like, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you get notified when I drop a new video, and I'll see you guys in the next video.